So, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Michael, also emeritus Professor Michael Jackson, Prof, was head of department when Pete and I did our doctorate many years ago. Abused and treated us with disdain. What else would you expect? And Mike is going to talk to us about his thinking on Cybernetics, Pragmatism, and Unifying the Systems approach. So, Michael, where you go. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Welcome, everybody. It's not often you get a chance to talk about ideas for 2-3 hours, especially if you work in universities. You don't get a chance to talk about ideas at all. So this is a very rare privilege, and I'm grateful for your attention and attendance. Yeah, I suppose that it'll come together, this talk, but please feel, I see it in two parts, as I'll explain later, but it's a complete discussion right through the period. So it's not as though I've got any slides or I'm going to give a presentation or lecture or anything, so please feel free to interject at any point. I've been worrying about the unity of the systems approach, by which I mean all those strands of the systems movement, cybernetics, complexity, stuff that comes from von Bertalanffy through systems methodologies, etc., for quite a long time. And it's clearly a pressing issue. If I were to give a theoretical example of how bad things are, some of you may know there's a group at Hertfordshire that Ralph Stacey founded on a complexity theory group, and head of that now is a guy called Chris Moles, and he recently published a book on complexity, an introduction. So I thought, I wonder if this has anything to say about the relationship between complexity theory, cybernetic systems, and how they stand together. So I looked in the index, and there isn't one mention of cybernetics, and there isn't one mention of systems thinking. I think there's one mention of system dynamics. That's it. That's it. I mean, that is appalling, really, unscholarly, unforgivable. But it's a reflection of the way some parts of the systems arena work. More practically, Go Science has been seeking to produce a toolkit or about the systems approach, systems thinking for senior civil servants. They call it a toolkit. And that's been hampered by the lack of clear agreement about what systems thinking broadly consists of. And I have had access to the final document because I was involved in the original consultation. And it falls short in many ways, but it's hardly surprising that they have difficulties with describing systems thinking in a way that they believe civil servants will understand it if we can't get our heads around the whole field ourselves and present it in a way which is accessible to them. That document was very, very bad, and I think that myself and some others have now stopped its publication, and there's going to be more consultation about it. Also involved with some work with the World Health Organization. They've got a massive health policy and systems research. Well, not massive, they've got a group of health policy and systems research people working a thing called the Alliance, which is funded by the World Health Organization. But their conferences are massive. They get about 2,000 people to these conferences in health policy and systems research. And yet they hardly speak at all about systems thinking. They're not related to the more generic systems community who put systems first and then the arena of application second, as it were. So at the moment, I'm trying to herd a set of systems thinkers to come up with a white paper on how systems thinking can help with health systems research and practice, with health system strengthening. in lower and medium income countries. And that's fraught with difficulties, again, because of the lack of unity in conception about what the systems approach as a whole is about. So very real issues, theoretically, practically, holding back the field in lots of different ways, in my view, at a time when we all agree, I guess, because you wouldn't be here if you didn't think this, that systems and cybernetics and complexity theory have a lot to offer to decision makers, policy makers, stakeholders, the underprivileged, have a lot to offer to organisations and society in dealing with the sort of problems that we're facing. So it's up to us to get our act together. My latest attempt to contribute in some way to this started perhaps about two years ago, when I got interested again in the work of Bogdanov, Alexander Bogdanov, who was an early, he was writing in the late 19th, early 20th century, Russian revolutionary who fell out with Lenin. I mean, you can go back obviously to Aristotle, the whole's more than the sum of its parts. You can look at Hegel's work, Spinoza, Marx, and find systemic aspects in there. But the first theorist, practitioner to really take on the notion of a new organizational view of the world was Bogdanov, putting organization and system right at the front of his theorizing, and his practice was Bogdanov. And I was reading a book of White's biography of Bogdanov called Red Hamlet, and there's a little bit in there, and he says, well, it's a real pity that since Bogdanov, the systems movement has splintered in so many ways, and perhaps Bogdanov, going back to Bogdanov, would enable us to bring some unity to it again. Because after all, Bogdanov, with the concept of a bi-regulator, anticipated Wiener's notion of negative feedback. The concept of an open system from Bert Lanfy is in Bogdanov. I'm in the middle of a paper looking at similarities in the work of Bogdanov and Stafford Beer, and there's some really significant similarities there. So I thought, well, this is interesting. Maybe we should be looking at this. Maybe I should be looking at this. But I couldn't really see it in Bogdanov's technology. I couldn't see how that could be a unifying book for the systems approach. Very much along the general systems line. Concept all systems have the same connections, demonstrate same relationships, have same laws in common. Okay, but you know, so but once you get behind technology and to the philosophy that inspired it in books like Bogdanov's books like Imperial Monism and Philosophy of Living Experience, then I think there's really some scope in Bogdanov for looking to the unity of the systems approach. So I was thinking, well, there's a philosophy here, but it's going to be hard to sell this on the basis of Bogdanov, and I recognize aspects of this philosophy. And when I started to look into it closer, it was absolutely clear to me that this philosophy was very, very closely related to pragmatism, to the pragmatism of Peirce and William James and Dewey, and of course to those of the original founding fathers of American pragmatism, with Mead. But pragmatism has become huge. Again, more recently, with people like Rorty's work, Habermas draw heavily on pragmatism. So I thought, well, Bogdanov, potentially unifying force, is philosophy very similar to pragmatism? Perhaps we've got a philosophy here which will stand up as a base for a unified philosophy for cybernetic systems and complexity theory. So that's what that's really what I want to explore. I think the talks on cybernetics and pragmatism and unifying the systems approach. So I'd like to divide the discussion into two parts. So before the coffee break, cybernetics and pragmatism. So I'll talk about the relationship. I'll talk about the pragmatism and its fundamentals. And then I'll talk about why I think cybernetics is pragmatist in orientation, and how I think pragmatism can unify cybernetics, first of all, because you've got these, or some people see differences between first, second, third, however many orders of cybernetics you want. So if we use pragmatism to somehow unify cybernetics and provide a philosophy for cybernetics, then we're going some way towards the ultimate aim of unifying the systems approach. And then after the coffee break, talk about other aspects of the systems approach, von Bertalanffy's work, the systems methodologies work, a bit about complexity theory, a bit about Eastern systems thinking, a bit about indigenous systems thinking, and come up with this notion that Bogdanov pragmatism can become the underpinning philosophy for all this stuff. That will mean drawing boundaries, of course. It mean we're also chucking some stuff out of what you might regard as the overall systems approach, but that's probably a good thing. We have to define where we are and what we're trying to do. We have somebody on the line. You know everybody, John?
Yeah, it's Abdul, it's fine.
Okay.
Okay, he's in now. He went to the wrong bloody link. That's why I was staring at this. It's trying to get in.
Right. Okay. Any contributions at that point, or clarification of what I'm going to be trying to do?
WOSEC contributes to the debate.
Sorry?
WOSEC, the World Organization of Systems and Cybernetics, and then not players.
They are players. They are players, and I attended most of the sessions at the last conference that they organised in Moscow, I think. And,
yeah, you didn't want to.
Yeah.
I was also in dark right there.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, they are, and
I was at the Rome one. It was enormous. Talk about the size of conferences.
Yeah. Yes, I was, and I'll say a little bit about the sort of Espejo-Lepsky third order cybernetics as I go through. Yeah. Just as we have a splintering of strands of systems thinking broadly defined, we have a splintering of system societies, don't we? With WOSEC, the ISSS. But they're small compared to the System Dynamics Society, the systems in GOSI. And, you know, I struggle with this. In GOSI, Megan, you know that I've been giving talks to the systems engineers about how they need to embrace a broader conception of systems thinking if they're going to realize their ambition of extending their thinking to and their work to broader socio-technical systems rather than just the technical systems on which they work. Project managers I talk to frequently, evaluators, all tend to adhere to one version of the systems approach rather than seeing it as an overall movement into which they can draw what's appropriate to the particular context they're addressing. People in the health policy and systems research, their starting point, health systems are complex adaptive systems. They don't really explore the meaning of that. And then their tool for looking at complex adaptive systems is system dynamics, almost inevitably. They say, okay, we've got complex adaptive systems, let's model them using system dynamics. Well, you know, probably, I'm not a great fan of David Snowden's, but that's taking an approach which might help with a complicated system and trying to apply it to a complex system. So, you know, it's a mess, and somehow we've got to get these ideas clear.
You say things are a mess. One of the things that's struck me is I'm just writing up my thesis at the moment using cybernetics. I've been bouncing around this idea of where does complexity fit into all of this? And it does. But what struck me is the lack of common lexicon and understanding. People using, it's a Wittgenstein thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
A word means something to me, which means something totally different.
Absolutely.
So that struck me as being a big barrier, that there isn't even an agreement on what these terms actually mean. The kind of follow-on from that is, certainly I found this at the business school, is breaking out of almost the playbook approach. That you read some literature, you find a gap, and then you empirically test that gap for something. And I think there's a lot of restriction on the way people think about research. Consequently, so things like pragmatism and verse are really, really difficult because you're coming up with common sense understanding of a situation rather than a deductive or an inductive hypothesis or proof of that particular thing. So I think
everybody likes PhDs to be straightforward empirical investigations because they can be completed in 3 years.
Yeah, and we follow this playbook, and here's the project, here's the critical path. And so that was one thing. The other thing I just kind of mentioned, I mean, John's come out of the room now, but I had a text actually from a colleague in Deloitte who was doing some work for government. Can't remember which department it's. That's not relevant. But the question was, he was doing a piece of work on environmental government departments as environmental systems, and could we have a discussion? Well, I said there's probably 2 books to read. One was Design and Freedom, and the other one was Intelligent Nation, because actually all of the answers you probably need you will find in those two texts. What that said to me is that government is asking the questions, but they're asking the questions of people who, Deloitte don't actually understand the answer. So there's a communication issue there. Because you just got consultants generating slideware, as opposed to answering some of those fundamental questions. So those are just some initial thoughts back.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with your second point. I think it's one of the problems that has impacted this Go Science toolkit, who they went to for the answers about what systems thinking was. But then you can't blame them because there are lots of different bodies that claim to represent systems thinking. So they go to one set of people, another set of people are going to disagree with the definitions. You make a very good point. The first point, because in seeking a unity to systems approach. When I say systems approach, I'm talking generally about all the systems orientated areas. At the moment, there seems to me to be two answers on the table to how do we present systems thinking. Some people call it sort of helicopter pitch, an elevator pitch to 5 minutes that will convince people that this has got something to offer. The first answer comes down to talking about the key systems concepts. Most people will say interrelationships, perspectives, boundaries. And then you get to the monster that is DSRP, the Cabrera monstrosity. And the problem with that is exactly what you described it. and you mentioned Wittgenstein, who's Wittgenstein's later philosophy represents the whole of philosophy in the 20th and 21st century, the linguistic turn, where concepts don't bear a one-to-one relationship to something in the world, they're systems of science and parts of a language. And so you cannot say that those individual terms are at the heart of the systems approach, because they mean different things to different people, depending on what language game you're playing. And the concept, let's take one concept, the concept of relationship, means something totally different in system dynamics, when it's causal relationships between parts. In systems engineering, it's probably system-subsystem relationships. In soft systems thinking, where it's relationships between different worldviews and perspectives, the concept just does not mean anything like the same. So in my view, that is a non-starter. And in fact, it's been very confusing. It's won the battle in evaluation. If people talk about the systems approach to evaluation, they'll say, well, it's bringing in the concepts of interrelationships, perspectives, boundaries. Oh, what the hell does that mean? You know, what do you do with it? Not only is it philosophically untenable, because of the Wittgensteinian argument and Peirce's argument and Heidegger's argument, and any philosopher, but it's confusing because they'll just simply interpret those terms according to their existing mindset. You get nowhere with it. So, and the second solution on the table is one that I'm going to try and present, talk about today. So that's the argument.
Sorry, oh, I'm jumping in and not sorry. Go on. Okay, so I find what you're saying very promising. Aspects of Bogdanov, aspects of pragmatism. Obviously, once you've got a great philosophy, it doesn't mean that everything ostensibly within that philosophy is necessarily going to be fruitful.
No.
I do recognise that what the systems and cybernetics self-labelling people criticise all other subjects for being too insular, they tend to recapitulate within themselves, and people work very hard at getting a certain world perspective, and then by the time they're my age, try and convince everybody else that is the one true way. Although, some of my friends were doing it when I was at college. So one of the things I wanted to repeat was kind of Kant's and affirmed by John Stuart Mill's perspective that you only get to the fundamentals of your subjects after it's been going for quite a long time. You build the neat philosophical foundations quite often later on, and the danger is of a kind of self-reinforcing grab of it's all really systems analysis or whatever. And the Tacitus say they make a desert and call it peace. If one bit of this conglomeration wins too early, ultimately we will be the losers, and there was so many ending to that. But I lost it, so
no, maybe we are in a better position now to. I think peace has broken out to some extent in the systems movement. People are a little bit more respectful of each other, apart from this bloody complexity theorist down in Hertfordshire. People are a bit more respectful of each other, but there's a long way to go to turning that into common ways of thinking. And all the different strands of systems thinking have their uses, but it's finding the commonality now that we can talk to each other better. The other point about I've made that point that we need to be talking to each other more. Systems engineers, cyberneticians, soft systems people, system dynamics people, so we can present a unified case about what's useful to about this stuff to decision makers, policy makers, and all the rest of it. The other side of it is we can become quite insular in our, you say the systems movement self-divide, but we don't talk much to social scientists or philosophers for the most part, or scientists. I mean,
in a lot of philosophy without knowing how much about professional philosophers, as I say.
Yeah.
I only encountered the term, whatever it was, term last week. But trouble with Wittgenstein is he says this is how you talk about things. If you can't talk about things this way, it's not a real scientific probably. It's kind of regression to the early logical positivists as far as Prof.
Well, yeah. Yes, that's right. I mean, I have to say in this forum that cyberneticians are some of the worst in terms of talking to. They grind out and develop their specialism in cybernetics using the same range of content, and that has strengths, of course, to develop on foundations and fundamentals. But I can't help thinking that cybernetics would benefit if it did have more exposure and exposed itself more and contributed more to the debates going on in social science and in philosophy, and listen to what those people had to say. It could move on quicker than it perhaps has done. I mean, fair play to von Forster and Glassersfeld and the rest for the second order cybernetics. But that could have been advanced much quicker if, you know, it's quite akin to soft systems thinking when you look at it in what implications it might have in practice. Of course, it's close to philosophies that were invented, you know, in pre-Socratics, if not in the mainstream of Greek philosophy itself. You can't put this thing down as a new invention. It adds things, but if the conversations were going on, they'd be much richer. And here's an argument for pragmatism again, and the importance of, if we can link the system's approach to pragmatism. This is from a book by Bacon on pragmatism. He says he's looking at Bernstein's work, a well-known contemporary pragmatist. In numerous books and essays, Bernstein argues that the important conclusions of 20th century philosophy can be understood as variations on the pragmatic themes. So he's saying that the big debates taking place in philosophy now, and the big debates taking place in social science now, are those around pragmatic themes. And so if we can link in systems, cybernetics, to those pragmatic themes, then we're going to have much more traction in talking to philosophers and social science, and making our own transdiscipline significant for them, and they'll see the relevance of it and note it much more. So it's not as though this is an opening. We're unifying the systems approach in my endeavour, but we're also opening it because we're acknowledging it's based upon a philosophy which other people recognise and use and talk about themselves, and so we're opening our transdiscipline to this whole other set of debates. What do we add to those debates? Well, we add actually a practitioner focus, the ability to translate ideas into practice. Because you could argue that pragmatism, despite its name, has become far too theoretical. It's lost all touch with practice. If you read some of the pragmatists, you perhaps see what I mean. And we maybe bring that bit down to earth again. And so we've got some real, you know, solid, valuable systems, models and methodologies which can help these people to perhaps realise the original ambition of pragmatism. So there's a real debate to be had there. Yeah.
I tried to figure out exactly what you're doing now indirectly, because I wanted to do my dissertation on cybernetics, systems theory, and understanding of services. You might know where this is going. And I started to realize it doesn't work very well to understand what's going on without complexity theory. So I thought to myself, oh, I've got a few months left for my dissertation. I'm just going to check out complexity theory and how that connects with cybernetics. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. There's no work on it whatsoever. So I was like, okay, that's not good. And so I started to do it myself. Okay, I'm doing my dissertation, let's see how they will both work together. Very difficult stuff. Thank God I got the dissertation, but then I could just carry on doing that.
Mm.
And everything you're saying really connects to my experiences. That is, there's not much, well, there's definitely commonalities in the ether, but there's no works right now helping people to use cybernetics, complexity theory, and any other branch.
Mm.
And that kind of limits everything.
There are links.
There are links, yeah.
I mean, clearly,
Not much.
Pigogene and Bertalanffy, there's close links. Some few complexity theorists, real complexity theorists, acknowledge Ashby and self-organization. All those concepts are all there in Ashby. But the secondary literature on complexity theory, no, and there is no. I wouldn't know where to go. I'd have to do, if I was looking for, like you, if I was looking for the link between cybernetics and complexity theory, I'd have to do all the research myself. I wouldn't be able to find a book that explained that to me, how complexity theories are built upon Ashby, for example.
I'm sorry, just to cover this, but are you suggesting that there is some kind of maturity model that needs to be somehow worked out? Models are probably too restrictive, actually. Maturity framework, perhaps, around unifying systems theories.
Yeah, I think at this point I'll go on to. It's worthwhile to put Bogdanov, because he was a systems theorist, alongside pragmatism. So what I'll do is just describe now 6 ways in which I think Bogdanov and Peirce, James and Dewey, 6 ideas they share in common. As somebody said, it's easy to go down the route of picking out those things they have in common and dumping everything else. But I've looked at this fairly closely, and I think for the most part, this stands up. And then we'll go on in the session before coffee to look at how those relate to cybernetics. I first came across the notion of cybernetics being a pragmatist, having a pragmatist orientation in, I've not really thought about that before until I read Pickering's book, the cybernetic brain. I don't know whether anybody knows it. Yeah. And that he was taken. He has his own language, which I can talk about. But he was basically, he said how the extent to which he was philosophically shaken up when he read William James's work, and that enabled him to make the links between cybernetics and pragmatism. And I have to admit that when I started getting into the pragmatists, you know, after I'd written papers saying that, you know, systems thinking shouldn't go down a pragmatist direction. I'd been arguing with this guy, fellow Centre for Systems Studies guy, Peter Zoo, for a long time, pushing pragmatism. And then when I read them, I thought, bloody hell, this stuff is, you know, I had to, over a period of time, I completely changed my way of thinking, and it was an enlightening experience for me to begin to see the world in their terms. And so I went through this kind of conversion to this way of thinking now. But anyway, I'll go through these 6 themes, I think, with Bogdanov.
I was just going to say, now just ask a question.
Yeah.
I've been in pragmatism since about 30 years. It was particularly quite that quick for one of the studies or issues that first one I was asking, why, I understand it's part of that process there. And if I've understood this right, and I don't fully understand it, he questioned whether the dualities, all these sorts of object subject and all that sort of thing emanates from the Greek philosophers. He questioned that and tried to have a system whereby the two combine.
Who did, sorry?
Combine.
Quine, yeah.
And so this is strikes me that this is moving towards second order cybernetics, as it were, because you can't make a distinction between the observer and what is being observed.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So when I go through this, perhaps the best way of doing this is for me to do these 6 themes, and you come in if they resonate with your understanding of cybernetics. I was going to try and suggest that at the end of doing the 6 themes, but no. But it's much better to do it this way. That you draw out these things, and this is my draft paper on what I'm saying today, and so I very much see this as an attempt to improve this paper from the things that you'll be contributing. It's called Rebooting the Systems Approach by Applying the Thinking of Bogdanov and the Pragmatists. So this session for me is a testing out of the ideas in this paper.
There's also a tension between throwing stuff in and stopping the speaker getting to the end of the
Yeah, but you know, I don't know what the end is, so I'm quite happy with that. Okay, the themes. First of all, there's a theory of knowledge theme which Bogdanov and the pragmatists share, and this is not surprising because they were both. Bogdanov's heavily influenced by an Austrian philosopher physicist called Ernst Mach, and so were the pragmatists through William James, particularly. Mach is, if you read English philosophy, a bit of a sideline, but incredibly influential. Influenced Einstein in his thinking that led to general relativity. And Heisenberg in coming up, if you read Ravelli's book, Helgeland, I'd recommend that. Have you read that, Peter? Helgeland? Yeah, he draws on Bogdanov, as you know, in there, and it goes back to Mach. Heisenberg was influenced by Mach, and the impact that Mach had on all these thinkers was to try and get rid of what Peirce called metaphysical rubbish, stuff that you couldn't directly relate to. So the theory of knowledge shared by Bogdanov and the pragmatists is against the what we ought to call the mirror of reality, the idea that knowledge somehow truth mirrors a world out there, and the idea it had to mirror a world out there goes back to Plato. You know, the idea that all we see are representations of the world on the back of the cave, Plato's cave, shadows from the fire, and what we don't see is reality going on out there, and somehow we have to get to that reality. And that was Descartes as well. I mean, Descartes then divides philosophy into a subject, which is trying to understand an object out there properly. And you can argue that the whole of Western philosophy since Plato has been trying to establish that relationship between knowledge and reality out there. Knowledge as a mirror of reality, as Rorty puts it. And this is what the pragmatists and Bogdanov challenge, because they say that knowledge isn't that at all. Knowledge is our ability to adapt to the world. It emerges during evolution. Cognition is an adaptation. And it comes from our need to understand the world in order to survive. And so...
Can we just back up? Do we actually need to understand the world in order to survive? Or do we only have to be able to perceive it in such a way that we can act so as we survive?
Yeah, the latter. I'm using understand to mean the latter.
That's fair.
Yeah. So this changes the whole nature of philosophy. In Peirce's terms, it's getting away from the metaphysical rubbish, the attempt to understand, you know, what James calls divinely instituted world enigmas, and which Dewey calls the pursuit of eternal wisdom, and starts to return philosophy to everyday concerns, the development of habits of action which allow us to survive better in the world. That's what it's about, you see, for these pragmatists. It's not about trying to understand, you know, what is reality? Does God exist or doesn't God exist? It's back to everyday concerns with survival.
Right, you said, sorry, before you move on from it, you said our ability to adapt to the world. Is there something also in there about our ability to adapt the world to ourselves? Or is it a one-way, unidirectional relationship? Is it bi-directional?
It's bi-directional at different levels as you go up, if you like, an evolutionary hierarchy. Whereas simple cells are spending most of their time adapting to the world, but we are much more able to make the world adapt to us, I suppose. So it goes up in that sort of way. But here's the quotes from, this is Bogdanov, and I have to say that Peter was responsible for the production of the first edition of Bogdanov's Volume 1 into English. So these quotes are mainly from that book. Bogdanov says, "Thus philosophical truth is a tool for living, as are all other truths. It's a tool for the general guidance of human practice, just as a compass and geographical chart are tools for guidance on journeys." You'd hardly get more pragmatic than that, can you? In terms of, and Menand, whose book on the pragmatists I can recommend, says this about Peirce, James and Dewey. They all believe that ideas are not out there waiting to be discovered, but are tools. He used that word tools, just as Bogdanov, translation, Bogdanov used the word tools, like forks and knives and microchips that people devise to cope with the world in which they find themselves. So coping with the world again. And once we see philosophy that way, as helping us to cope with the world, it starts to make it relevant to everyday affairs. It's not sitting back in our studies as Descartes did, as an individual I, trying to recognize through I think, therefore I am, and to build up from there to a picture of the world. You don't need to do that, according to the pragmatists. We're always engaged with the world. Perhaps we've evolved as part of the world. Naturally, we relate to the world. We have a vision of it that enables us to survive, at least. But that takes us nowhere near to an objective account of what the world is like. It's just one possible way of surviving, just as a cell has a way of surviving and has its cognition related to that. Dog does, cat does, we have. They're all possible ways of surviving in the world, and they don't take us any nearer to an objective account of the nature of the world. We can't be bothered with that. Everything is going to be based upon the fact that we're embodied. Cognition is embodied, and we're no different from animals in that respect.
So, just one question to this. I just wonder how does that relate to our understanding and use of quantum technologies?
Yeah, I mean, I could give you quotes from Ravelli, which is a pragmatist. He would say that they are things such as quantum technology enable us certainly to better predict and control aspects aspects of the world that we're dealing with, but you can't presume that they give us an objective count of the nature of reality. They're just like, you know, another stage of human understanding in terms of its coping with the world, just as Ptolemy's account of the universe was, and then Newton's account of the universe, and then Einstein's account of the universe. They're all mechanisms for coping. They don't necessarily take us to an objective account of the nature of the world, as you can see by the fact that one replaces their alternatives, and some would say one replaces another, some would say the alternative conceptions. So you can the pragmatists vary on this, and it's not an argument I'd want to get into about, you know, how close we're getting to an understanding of an objective. Nobody's denying that there is an objective world, by the way. It's just saying that because as embodied cognitive beings, we're not going to be able to expect to understand it.
So I talk about sort of the discard idea of, you know, I think therefore I am. But one of the things that's come out certainly for me in my explorations has been pragmatism, which is a theory on one of the theories in my own sort of thesis, is that it's constantly butting against determinism, constantly butting against this scientific paradigm that we've kind of grown up with since, you know, well, it's evolved, isn't it? And you still see those kind of deterministic behaviors in every facet of society, whether it's government, whether it's business schools, whether, you know, whatever it is. Isn't that the challenge then? That you're constantly pushing against some quite simplistic interpretations around causation.
Yeah, okay, I will. This is one of the 6 themes, so I will come on. No, that's absolutely fine. So the second theme is then the social construction of knowledge, and it begins to get to the point that's just been made. Yeah, I mean, Bogdanov is very clear about this, and knowledge emerges from collective experience for him, from the social labor practice. He was a Marxist, of course, and he took these ideas from Marx, but developed them. And he uses, in the philosophy of living experiences, he uses the work of a linguistic thinker called Noire, and how language develops. And according to Noire, language develops from people undertaking tasks, which might be hunting a bison or something. And it starts with them, you know, grunting at each other. And then gradually language evolves as they seek to coordinate their activities in this task of social labor. And similarly, as they make a community or make huts in their village or whatever. And as society evolves, doesn't change, and knowledge emerges as part of social labor. And this is present in peers as well, that clearly ideas are never ratified or by individuals. It's gaining the involvement of a community, which is important. If the community comes to share ideas, because it enables them to practice successfully in whatever activities they're engaged in, then it becomes the truth, becomes knowledge as far as they're concerned. So here's some quotes. Bogdanov, in the final analysis, thought takes its form from social practice, or to put it another way, interconnectedness of the elements of experience in cognition has as its basis the correlation of the elements of social activity in the labour process. Menand, again, because he summarizes the view of all three pragmatists, the founding pragmatists, they believed that ideas are produced not by individuals, but by groups of individuals, that ideas are social. Again, it's, you know, it's a real hit to Descartes. But that inevitably leads to the third thing, seems to me, which is that there are no universal truths.
Is that one?
Pardon?
Is that one?
No. That there are no universal truths. And this is what, of course, got Bogdanov in a real mess with Lenin, because it was hard for Bogdanov to convince Lenin that Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, Marx and Engels' work didn't present universal truths about the nature of society and the nature that society, the directions in which society might go. Lenin wanted to say, here we have a science of society in the same way that we have a science of physics and so on. And Bogdanov said, no, you don't, unfortunately, because there are no universal truths. Truths relate to particular eras. Knowledge relates and is useful in a particular era. You never get behind the historical period in which truth is useful. Bogdanov put it this way. He said that, but since the material basis of society means that the property of changing as society develops, it became clear that all given ideological forms can only have historically transient and not objectively super-historical meaning. They can be truth for their times, objective truth, but only within a certain era, and in no way truth for eternity. There are no truths for eternity. It's like, you know, Newton was a truth for an era, but it wasn't a truth for an eternity because it was overthrown by the Einsteinian paradigm, which again is a truth for its era. It helps us now. Mm-hmm. And in no way truth for eternity. He goes objective in the absolute meaning of the term. Yeah. And James, commenting on this, and I think this relates to a point here, you were saying people are still stuck in deterministic thinking about causality. Well, this is me, but for James, there's no absolute truth because reality is forever changing. It's in flux, not complete and ready-made, as the rationalists believe. And then this is James. Meanwhile, we have to live today by what truth we can get today and be ready tomorrow to call it falsehood. And the reason is that we're part of creating this reality. We're not determined by ultimate causal laws. We are, as individuals, involved in the creation of reality. Sorry?
Descartes made the same point about philosophers who question everything, but when they go into everyday life, they have to obey the laws and follow the norms and customs and so on and so forth. They question that. This is what's central thing.
Yes.
Might change it later on or whatever, but for
Yeah. Well, I think that was Hume actually, but yeah, and Descartes may have made the point as well. It's all right doubting everything, but when we live in our everyday life, we can't doubt it. But nevertheless, they start from the point of doubt. You see, they start from the point of doubt and say, how can we overcome this doubt? And the pragmatists say, well, don't bloody doubt, that's how you overcome it. You know, we're part of the world, living in the world, have experienced the world and engaged with the world and successfully done so. So forget your doubt. Let's just develop habits of action which enable our success in the world. There's different orientation. And they would argue that this attempt to overcome this doubt is what's held Western philosophy back for 2,500 years.
There's no absolute truth.
Yeah.
That sounds more like postmodernism. There's no absolute truth.
Well, if you want to say that, but I mean, yeah.
And turn the statement back on itself. Including that statement.
That's what people did to the postmodernists. Yeah. But I mean, postmodernism is I don't know the extent to which they read the pragmatists, but I thinking about what they say, I find much in there that isn't already in pragmatism. Maybe you can.
Well, that's a good question. So this is about how useful ideas are. Useful is corrected. So how do we judge the relative usefulness of ideas? And I'm thinking about sort of preempting some of the points. That for me as a clinician is one of the things that would focus my attention to. How do we make that judgment using this concept?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and actually the concept of pragmatism derives from the term derives from Kant, and his example is a clinical example. Kant talks about a doctor coming across a patient who he thinks has a particular disease. A disease I'd never heard of in Kant. And he says, well, you know, you can spend all your time looking for all the scientific evidence of, and going to this test, that test, all the other tests, taking weeks and months about it, but actually you're forced to act now on the basis of the what Peirce would call the habits of action that have grown up. The best knowledge available to you at the time, which you're constantly seeking to, or other people are seeking to test, and you're seeking to test. But it's the credibility of these habits of action which allow you to act pragmatically in the moment. And that's what we should be paying attention to, not seeking for universal truth.
It's interesting to sort of in part the difference between how I act as a clinician and the scientific context when they are doing their research. There is a difference in the approach and what we're attempting to do. I have to make a decision about what to do with the patient. My scientific colleagues are trying to understand the basis of these things. So actually the role of the idea is different. Do you think in that situation?
The pragmatists would say no, that they're not necessarily different in form. In other words, your scientific colleagues are still kidding themselves if they're seeking universal truths in what they're doing. But of course, they're advancing things in a different way to which you as a clinician are doing in acting in the everyday world. It's almost a difference between Peirce's pragmatism. Peirce is a much more Peirce, or whatever you pronounce it, is a much more scientific pragmatist, and his work is based upon the scientific, very closely on the scientific method, and he has this concept of fallibilism. You'll never arrive at a truth, but a truth is as good as knowledge as the community has at a particular time. But be ready to expect it to blow up, you know, and go wrong. Like maybe the understanding of cancer or something can change over time, or our understanding of, you know, we all thought we had the answer when we when we had molecular biology and genes, we could cure everything. Then you suddenly understand that it's the interactions between the genes. I'm talking outside my field, you know better. So that's still pragmatic. Where James is much more interested in pragmatism in everyday life, how the physician might work, or how an educator might work, or a psychologist might work, having to take. James essentially says you can't wait. You know, you can't wait. You've got to do something as a physician. I'm trying to find the.
I think there's a point in where we're kind of conflating the outcome with the method. So when you act as a diagnostician, and therefore investigating the therapeutic, I think your scientific colleague is using experimental design in the same way as you're using diagnostics. So what they're trying to do is structure their view of the world in such a way that they start, but that is future focused, and all of that is in the extent to which it works when they test. Whereas the organisation to the extent that they're not dead with the future. Not a lot to get to. But I think it's the processes are parallel, but different in where the approach is considered.
Yeah, I think that's right. This is the Kant quote. The physician must do something for a patient in danger, but he does not know the nature of his illness. He judges it to be a case of phthisis, P-H-T-H-I-S-I-S. It's an ancient conception of some disease. Now, even in his own estimation, his belief is contingent only. Another observer might perhaps come to a sounder conclusion. Such contingent belief, which yet forms the ground for the actual employment of means to certain actions, I entitled pragmatic belief. That's Kant. And then they take this idea forward. And actually, acting on the basis of pragmatic belief is what most people do most of the time. This area of pragmatism is huge. You know, the area where we can actually operate on very, very well-established habits of action in science is relatively narrow in the human experience compared to other huge areas. You know, how we control the environment, how we organize society, how we get rid of poverty and all the rest of it.
So pick up on what you were saying there. See, that's right. The medical science and Oliver Sacks and the way his body of knowledge was developed. So my understanding is he was quite shunned by his pragmatic views of treating what we see and then seeking to understand it as opposed to following the scientific paradigm that kind of, you know, allowed to publish his publications apparently. And he was on this journey of discovery around treating Parkinsonian sort of diseases, that kind of stuff. Yet his contribution now, I think, to scientific knowledge and the ideas of clinical practice have been quite significant. I don't mean in relation to your question, but you kind of resolve that.
Not really, because I think there's certain types of conceptions of knowledge that are valued more than others within medical science as well. So I haven't necessarily got the sort of the class science type approaches in the areas, that clinical description and the trying to understand the basis of that is still a cool part of medical knowledge. The ultimate what tends to happen now is it's got value and that's one for so I think we also missing there's a gap. I think there's a medical knowledge and the value of what's valued and what's not the relationship. So there is a gap that is not. There's an interesting point about how like I said, those sorts of things are immense about how we approach explanations. Ultimately, it's the basis of what we do, but it's not how it's
They had very different concepts of the well, no, they didn't. Peirce was much closer to traditional view of science, and this is Dewey, but nevertheless, Dewey regarded the scientific method in a broad sense of a commitment to open-mindedness, flexibility, and a willingness to be swayed by the evidence as applicable to all domains, including politics and social life. James and Dewey took the ideas of pragmatism way beyond what Peirce would have regarded as legitimate. And so Dewey felt that moral hypotheses could be tested and judged according to their utility. James had the concept of what pays, you know, and James was also religious in orientation, and he got into a lot of trouble because he said, well, you can say that religion is true because it gives people a lot of psychological comfort in life. Bogdanov got into trouble because the notion that there were no universal truths only have meaning in relation to a particular era. Lenin took his ideas from a theorist called Plekhanov, who was straight down the line deterministic Marxist and believed in things in themselves, all the things that Mach and Bogdanov didn't believe in. And so Plekhanov says, well, in that case, you must believe in hobgoblins and sprites. And Lenin used that because people used to believe in them at one time. And interestingly, Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, criticizes William James on exactly the same basis. He says, well, you must believe in Santa Claus then, because lots of people get a great deal of pleasure out of belief in Santa Claus. And that seems to bring us a payoff in life. And that's quite a hard criticism for pragmatists and Bogdanov to answer. And it revolves around, you know, how does this concept fit in with all the other ideas which allow us to advance as a human species and to create a better world and fulfill our potential more in that world, how it's to cohere with other beliefs. In other words, if you believe in Santa Claus, if you believe in Santa Claus, then you've probably got to abandon the whole of the progress that's been made in medical science. So you're probably better abandoning the belief in Santa Claus. And Bogdanov would have argued similarly that once you get different conceptions, ideologies developing, which are more broad-ranging and have a greater chance of leading to happiness and better human society, better payoffs, then you give up on hobgoblins and sprites.
You did actually contrast with the sort of scientific view that we were looking at, the dead universe, which goes, you know, completely cold and whatever. That's our ultimate fate according to scientific theory.
Yeah.
And the sort of nihilism, as compared with, you know, having a religious view, having code, Western society, and all those sorts of things. So it's contrasting those two views.
Yeah, James did.
Yeah.
And you probably see the link there to Wiener, negative entropy. Okay, I'm going to whip through the last three. This is going fine, by the way, John, for time.
You're happy, I'm happy.
But I am going to whip through the last. Well, I've done scientific method now, so I'm going to do the two other things that Bogdanov and the pragmatists have in common that I think we need to take account of in providing this philosophical base for cybernetics and systems and complexity. And we can do all those after the break, rather than seeking to do that now, which are human agency and a vision of the nature of society and education. So going back to the starting point, and it's what's Richard. It's what Richard was saying, that what both Bogdanov and Dewey would argue is that if theories are not attempts to mirror the world, but attempts to help us to cope with the world, adaptations to the world, then really we should use theories of instruments of action to try and change existing realities for the better. That's what theory and truth and knowledge is about. You know, let's develop them so that they can enable us to change existing realities for the better. How does Dewey put that? He says that, well, this is me again, for Dewey, what's the spectator theory of knowledge? Dewey calls it the spectator theory of knowledge. This is what Rorty called philosophy as the mirror of nature. The idea that somehow we stand back and observe a reality which is out there. Dewey, once the spectator theory of knowledge is abandoned and the self is seen as part and parcel of events, this idea of self and knowledge as adaptations, then the possibility arises for philosophy to help us act in a purposive and intelligent way. Philosophy recovers itself when it ceases to be a device for dealing with the problems of philosophers, contemplating whether God exists or not, and becomes a method cultivated by philosophers for dealing with the problems of men, Dewey said, people. Bogdanov, of course, took his lead from Marx. He was a Marxist, and you only have to use the famous Marx quote, philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it, to use theory to change the world for the better. And being a Marxist, Bogdanov believed that the proletariat, working class, was the force for changing the world. And so it appeared at that time, I guess. And Bogdanov put the proletariat as a laboring class that is directly involved in production. In its work, it confronts and continually overcomes the resistance of external nature in science. It begins to be conscious of itself as a separate class in the era of machine production, which unites the forces of people in a broadly collective scale and overcomes the most colossal resistance of elemental forces. And Bogdanov said that what we need are theories and sciences which can help us in this, in being able to manage our way in the natural world and also create a better social reality. And he came up with this notion of the proletariat as world builders. For the first time, we had the capability to take on the task of world building. And his technology was his contribution, he felt, to this, bringing together all the knowledge we have of organization in the natural realm with what we know about it in the social realm, and creating a general organizational science, which the proletariat could take on board and use to become world builders, creating society anew.
And better in there, Mike. It's twice you've used it.
Sorry?
I'm not complaining. You twice used the word a better word. And I'm not trying to work out in this sort of description who's defining better.
Yeah. Okay. That's the second point. The final point of. But incidentally, this concept. I mean, when Bogdanov talks about this concept of the proletariat as world builders and using science as world builders to become world builders, and he does so from a Marxist perspective, you find in Stafford Beer exactly the same conception in designing freedom, of making science a liberty. In the Chilean work, science was to come to the aid of the people to create a better society based upon eudaimonia. Stafford used the Aristotelian concept of eudaimonia, a society in which everybody could realize their own potential, but at the same time contribute to the whole. And he was led to some very radical ideas on the basis, not of Marxism, but on the basis of eudaimonia. And we find the same notion there in Designing Freedom, where Stafford talks about, you know, science has been hitherto in the service of our enemies. We must make it become to the service of people. Science must be orientated to people. And he says that all the discussions in Chile were about bringing science to bear to help the people to create the society that they wanted to create. Exactly the same notion as you find in Bogdanov, but I'm jumping ahead.
But John, you mentioned autonomy. That was one of your when you described the VSM. So presumably your better world is a world in which people have more autonomy. But to come back to James's discussion here about religion and so on, people have to have guiding lights, and so in terms of better, that presumably relates back to that, and relates back to your religion about autonomy.
Well, for me, it's about people having information to be able to make choices, they're defining better in their own terms, as opposed to me defining it for them.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, that is defining your better. And we all have presumably better, our own definition of what better is. And it is really going back to what James, because I vaguely understand it, is talking about religions. That's what we're guiding in principles of our life.
Well, yes. Let me just finish the final one, because this debate, this is very relevant to this debate, which is their conceptions, the pragmatists and Bogdanov, of society and the education necessary to make society work better, because they both had the conception of society as a social organism that had somehow to be balanced, and Bogdanov's conception came from well, it was based upon the work of people like Darwin and Spencer, and so there's lots of biological analogy in Bogdanov. And he had this notion of society as a balanced social organism. So let's go to quote from Bogdanov. This was very important, his notion of society as a social organism and things in equilibrium. And as those of you familiar with Bogdanov, one of his most important laws was the law of the leasts, where you had to, specific example, if you were trying to develop society in Russia, then you had to look to the interests of the peasantry and how that balanced with the interests of the working class and intellectuals and all the rest of it. And of course, this was exactly what pissed off Stalin again, because he wanted to develop the society rapidly in an industrial direction to develop, to advance the proletariat, the working class, whereas, and he was quite willing to kill off hundreds of thousands of kulaks to achieve that. And therefore he had to denounce Bogdanov, and he had to denounce Bukharin, who'd taken Bogdanov's ideas forward, and the notion of society as a social organism where the different parts are in equilibrium. And so, but Bogdanov described this most clearly in his science fiction novel, Red Star. Is it Red Star? Yeah. Which defines a communist society on Mars. The first Bolshevik utopia, it was subtitled. And this is me describing the society that Bogdanov envisaged. He said, the product of steady social evolution over centuries, the communist society. There's no state, no markets, no money, no authority relations. The universal science of organization, technology, is employed to ensure that the social organism adapts to internal and environmental changes and progresses on the basis of a moving equilibrium maintained by a central institute of statistics. Work is voluntary and unpaid because there is more than enough for all and consumption is unlimited. Authority rests with those with the appropriate knowledge, and job rotation is encouraged. There is much emphasis on enhancing comradely cooperation valuing equality and collectivism, all gender discrimination is eliminated, and so on. The perfect utopia, the social organism balanced in a state of equilibrium, a central institute of statistics finds out, you have an overall plan, and the Central Institute for Statistics looks and sees if the plan is falling down in some respects, and then people voluntarily move into that area. Let's say you need lots up your steel production to make the plan work, then people voluntarily move into that sector of society, that sector of production and the economy, to ensure that steel comes up to meeting the nature of the plan. And the whole thing is controlled not by authority relationships, but by this Central Bureau of Statistics. Now, when I'm working on this paper on the relationship between Bogdanov's work and Stafford Beer's work, obviously I think about the work in Chile and the sending of information around society in Chile and the way that the operations room was sending statistics out so that people could correct if things were going awry in their factory or in their sector of society. And this concept is exactly the same concept that Bogdanov had. And Dewey had a similar conception of the social organism for American society. He was much influenced by Hegel in his early days, was Dewey. And he saw people and the social organism as being an intimate relationship. For Dewey, people get their individuality and their capacities from society. There's this link, you know, we're not Descartes individuals contemplating it. Everything we have actually comes from society. We create society, society creates us. For Dewey, it's a social relationship. He said society in its unified and structural character is the fact of the case. It's not Margaret Thatcher, you know, we're individuals and somehow there's no society. For Dewey, society is its unified and structural character is the fact of the case. The non-social individual is an abstraction. Descartes' individual, Thatcher's individual, is an abstraction arrived at by imagining what man would be if all human qualities were taken away. To function successfully, an organism must have a common will and purpose arrived at through the democratic participation of all its members. And then Dewey went on to criticize US society because it was not that. You know, democracy was a very limited aspect of it. It didn't extend to the industrial realm, for example. It didn't extend to women. It didn't extend to other racial groups in the US. It was very limited, that concept of, and he had a notion of positive freedom rather than negative freedom. American society was based on negative freedom, the state not getting in your way, but nothing there of positive freedom, having the means to realize your potentiality, to take your choices. And that wasn't available to women or to blacks or to other groups. It wasn't available to you in industry. And so you're led to think, you know, what would have happened in Russia, the Soviet Union, if Bogdanov's ideas had won over Lenin's, or more properly Stalin's conception of society, and how much better and how much more quickly the US might have advanced if it had taken Dewey's pragmatism more seriously and done something about making a proper democracy, which involved all people based upon positive rather than negative freedom. You could see the history of the 20th century being totally different, I think. It's a wild mind game because, of course, we know the historical dynamics of Soviet society. And we know the capitalistic dynamics of American society. But nevertheless, visions which would have created a wholly different 20th century if Bogdanov's ideas and Dewey's ideas had been taken forward.
The Centre for Curriculum Studies was run by a guy called Dick Kelly.
Sorry?
I said about the curriculum studies was run by a guy called Dick Kelly.
Yeah.
I think he's not anyone no longer with us. But he was, my whole pragmatic thing comes from Dewey.
Right,
He was pressing how we incorporate Dewey's ideas into the educational system.
absolutely.
And so on. So that's where I'm basically coming from.
That's absolutely, yeah. I mean, Dewey founded a school based upon his pragmatist ideas, and everybody worked, knowledge is communal, he said, remember that early point? So everybody worked in groups, didn't work individually to try and discover things. And you did it on the basis of your ability to create something in the world. Cooking was core to the curriculum in Dewey, because from cooking something, creating something, you could learn about nature, you could learn about physics, you could learn about chemistry, about biology, about working together as a team. So you worked on that kind of, and the education was based on those around a cooperative project. Yeah.
He was involved in the forming dispute or something, Dewey.
Oh, there was an industrial dispute in which he took sides, yes. Very much the side of Labour.
I have a bit of an issue with Volkanov. I read a bit of it. I like it. To mention about it. There is a lot of problems though with some of the things he says with what we know now. How, let's say, central authority works, and a lot of people in one massive department say, okay, you can voluntarily come in, find out some, that's feedback, right? And there's a real science of information now. And a lot of things he said were right then, but may not be right in the world that's becoming increasingly interdependent, emergent, non-linear, etc., etc. So I really would have liked Volkanov to come in instead of Stalin and have his philosophy work. But I would think that a lot of what happened after, like it happened with Stalin, would have probably happened with Volkanov for other reasons. And it wouldn't have necessarily been Volkanov's fault, but the situation in Russia. One thing I feel like we might not have mentioned enough here might be the situation that we find ourselves socially, economically, within different time periods throughout history. And that informs a lot of how we start thinking about theories.
Well, that's exactly the point of
right.
Bogdanov and the pragmatists.
But then what happens there is they inform each other cyclically, but it's very difficult to find out what happened after.
Well, Bogdanov, of course, was
where it came from before.
Yeah, but Bogdanov was absolutely clear. I mean, he was involved as a leader in the 1905 revolution. And my suspicion is that his work took on a pragmatist bent because of that experience. In other words, the level of violence that was thrown up there, and the response from the government, which was violent, oppressive and horrible. And he started talking about much more about the conditions necessary for a true socialist communist revolution. And he was always clear that just concentrating on the economics of the situation was never enough. You had to transform the thinking of the proletariat. And he was involved in this thing called Prolet cult, which was evolving a proletarian culture. And he wanted a workers' encyclopedia and workers' science, which would serve the. And of course, you're also when you're describing that aspect of Bogdanov, you're working from Red Star, the novel, I think, which is, remember, was centuries of evolution on Mars before you got to that particular state. Nevertheless, Bogdanov's concept of a central statistical agency corresponds with what Stafford Beer tried to do in Chile through Cybernet.
There are major differences there. Major differences.
Well, of course, because Bogdanov didn't even have computers. Beer had a few computers, and the reason that had to be centralized was because there were so few computers. But it did demonstrate on the second Gremios strike that I think they kept the distribution system going with something like 15% of the trucks, but it worked just as well through information flows and working that information properly as it had done under capitalism, with 15% of the the operation still working. That shows the power of information in a society. And you know what followers of Bogdanov and Stafford would say is that we are now in a position to create a society based upon information and the rapid flow of information, which would be more efficient and effective, as well as more emancipatory than capitalism, because we are capable of managing information much quicker, much more quickly than the market can manage.
Perfect, Scott.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I'll get started. I think it's worked well. It wasn't how I intended it to work, but it's worked well. In that what's happened is that we've got all the foundations in place for the second part of this, which is we've got a set of ideas which I think potentially can unite cybernetics and systems theory and complexity theory. So we're looking at how that can be, well, whether that has potential as an argument now. Can we find enough in cybernetics and systems and complexity that relates to what we've just been putting forward? And if we can, then I think we've got a potential to unite them. Let's start with cybernetics and pragmatic aspects and pragmatism as a potential philosophy for cybernetics. This is Nicholas Rescher, a late pragmatist, still alive, I think. And he says Peirce's pragmatism is scientifically elitist, James's is psychologically personalistic, and Dewey's is democratically populist. But they're all pragmatisms. Now, what I want to do is to relate those to what commonly called first order, second order, and potentially third order cybernetics. And I might ask for Peter's help in describing what third order cybernetics is, because I'm not entirely certain about it. But I think we can find enough to say that first and second order, potentially third order cybernetics are actually best understood as forms of pragmatism. Wiener, incidentally, thank you for that. I'm going to have a look at this museum, but he studied with Dewey, and he read everything that James wrote. He was a dedicated reader of William James's stuff. So how does Wiener's work relate to pragmatism? Well, certainly what we have is commonality in all sort of. He's interested obviously in adaptation, and he sees this run through of adaptation in the mechanical realm to negative feedback, in the biological realm, homeostasis, in the social realm, extremely interested in the notion of information and feedback in society. So the notion of knowledge as an adaptation and cognition as an adaptation runs right through Wiener's work, I think. And there's also this idea in Wiener that you don't necessarily need to have an exact scientific model. In fact, it's probably hopeless to try and gain exact scientific models in order to decide how to act and how things work, and therefore how to act. That you can draw upon knowledge from nature or in order to learn. You can make leaps of the imagination. You can make creative analogies. You don't have to. This, of course, was present in Ashby. Or maybe we'll come on to that later. I think we'll come on to that later. But I mean, the guy who was the best at this was Stafford Beer. I mean, the concept that instead of trying to create a controller for a factory from a huge understanding of what a factory was like, but to think of the potential of a pond, as he does in cybernetics and management, you link your factory to a pond, which naturally reestablishes an equilibrium in itself. So when the factory goes out of equilibrium, if it's linked to a pond, sends the pond out of equilibrium, the pond restores its equilibrium, and then the factory can restore its equilibrium. What a stretch of the imagination. What a huge imaginative leap. You know, you don't have to understand the factory, you can learn about it from a pond. Unfortunately, he could never, I don't think, ever manage to interest ponds in factories. Or,
Can I tell you about it?
Yeah.
It got complicated.
no, I love it. But,
We used to go out and collect daphne, you know, the little water.
Yes.
And you had a big aquarium study with tricks for measuring whatever, counting. And he used to feed them on food that had been infested with iron filings. And for 20 minutes, this thing would work, and then of course the things would start excreting. So you just never got around that.
So the demand for, their requirement for survival overcame their requirement to link to the factory, as it were.
Yes.
Yeah. And of course, the viable system model. There must have come a time when Stafford, he didn't think that any of the mechanistic models that Ashby was devising as adaptive brains were going to be able to be suitably deal with the complexity needed to manage an organization. So he takes the leap of neurophysiology, the way that the nervous system controls the brain and the body, and incorporates that as an analogy. And perhaps even more remarkable, team's integrity. I mean, there you've got people like Habermas spending decades reading the whole of philosophy, social theory and all the rest of it to arrive at a conception of a democratic society and a democratic organization, one free from the power of argument, communicative competence in society. And Stafford just picks a geometrical form, the icosahedron, and says perhaps we can see this as the basis for a way of democratically organizing an organization. Remarkable. And all based on, you know, this is cybernetic thinking at its very, very best and its most imaginative. Taking ideas and seeing if they work, not necessarily building huge scientific models. And this is pragmatism. And Wiener was pragmatic in those senses, I think. If we get to second order cybernetics, I think the pragmatism underpinning second order cybernetics is even clearer. Von Glasersfeld, I guess, was ultimately the philosopher that they all went to. Von Foster discovered von Glasersfeld, the other way around, or they mutually discovered one another. And von Glasersfeld at some stage read Bogdanov, and he was absolutely amazed that in Bogdanov he found the basis for his radical constructivism, or that Bogdanov had anticipated radical constructivism by so many decades. I'm going to have to look through it. This is, I mean, von Glasersfeld says he saw some work of Bogdanov's and was just amazed by it, and wrote a paper on it so he could better understand it. And this is what he says. Bogdanov deliberately demolishes the illusion that human knowledge could provide a true image or a reflection, or as the present day philosophers would say, a representation of ontological reality. The correspondence Bogdanov has in mind is a functional and instrumental one. This is going back to knowledge as an adaptation. This leads him to hold that a tool that satisfactorily serves its purpose in a given context does not become a bad or useless tool merely because one discovers it is not useful in circumstances that lie outside its original range of application. This is precisely the position that radical constructivism has adopted, he says. So there's our link to from second order, the best philosopher of second order cybernetics, to Bogdanov and to pragmatism. And I think you find the same in Maturana and Varela. Just to pick an aspect of Maturana's work, we have his notion of languaging as being the coordination of consensual actions, and that is exactly what Bogdanov drew on from Noire in his account of how language and ideas developed. Though I have to say that I think Bogdanov links that conception to the development of society in a way that Maturana actually didn't achieve. Hence the call for a third order.
You may get stuck with their systems. So much rather breaks the systems that also is strictly biological. So it's happening in a medium rather than spoke to the construction of the medium itself.
I'm not entirely sure about that. I think that's one reading of. I think there's a tension in Maturana, and the first, what you've just described is the first Maturana.
Yeah.
Where there is a second Maturana, which is all about cognition and the rest of it, where you do construct a world. The organism constructs its own world, and so do individuals. I'm just looking for a quote from Maturana, which links it into Noire and Bogdanov. Yeah, this is about language, but upon language develop ideas. This is Maturana. Accordingly, I claim that the phenomenon of language takes place in the co-ontogeny of living systems, where two or more organisms operate. Through their recurrent ontogenic consensual interactions, so this is just the people working to hunt or to build a hut, in an ongoing process of recursive consensual coordination of consensual coordinations of actions or distinctions. You know how difficult Maturana is with his language sometimes. He's saying what Bogdanov said, that language develops from this attempt to socially undertake particular tasks where you coordinate actions, and ideas arrive from that. So there's a lot in there. Second order cybernetics from Glassesfeld, Maturana, and the rest of it's all there in not obviously worked out, and this very much enriches Bogdanov's ideas, but the similarity is there in the underlying conception. And third order cybernetics is to my mind, is Dewey. It's the relationship, instead of with Maturana, which remains in a sense at the level of the psychology and the individual. It's much more related in third order cybernetics to society, and therefore to Bogdanov. And when people talk about third order cybernetics, I think they're talking about the relationship between individuals and society in the way that Dewey talked about one being a creation of the other. Not all the individuality is created by society. You can't take an individual out of society and expect to get anything. There's nothing left. We're all created by the societies in which we happen to be thrown, in Heidegger's terms. And I don't know, that if there's going to be a third order cybernetics, then Bogdanov's the good starting point as any, in my view, or Dewey. And I think there probably has to be, if cybernetics is going to be capable of exploring the kind of issues that societies throw up. Ewan, what's your reading of third order cybernetics?
I'm not entirely sure. I'm tied up with some of the origin of third order cybernetics. I'd like to think it was designing the mechanisms to create a society that allowed for the identification and fulfillment of potential, which talks to many of the stuff that certainly probably stuff from the way it's done.
Yeah.
I'm worried that there are bits in it that come across almost religious. I don't mean the capital, I mean this moral drive rather than the sort of the group. You know, you can see in TSI that it's a group of people creating their own values. You can see in Proletariat, the idea is to create a set of social driven values. I worry in any of these where there has to be an elite, whether it ends up becoming self-serving. I know that the foundational mechanisms of that were designed for that purpose. So they've actually, but it wasn't designed for society, it was designed for being led.
But yeah, that's, I mean, I think all those points are valid, but do you see the need for a third order cybernetics beyond the second order? I mean, when
I'm not entirely, I think if the difference between the levels is simply the content that it's applied to, I don't think there are all for cybernetics, I think there are all systems.
But von Forster, for example, was always criticised as, you know, increase the choices available to people. Well, hang on, you know, not everybody has the same choices available. These are choices available that are made available by society to people. The way that society operates determines the level of choice you have, and not everybody has access to the same choices. So this is to that kind of thinker, that kind of von Forster second order cybernetics is quite naive. It leaves aside the societal equation. That potentially a third order cybernetics based upon Dewey and Bogdanov would bring very much onto the table.
Yeah, I think some of what I'm proposing is sophistry, isn't it? It's sort of, it is third order cybernetics, cybernetics of third order systems, and third order systems which have cybernetics don't therefore generate a third order cybernetics. Is it the thing? Is there something? I'll back up. I'll answer your question first, because I'm wandering off the question. I think there's a need for something that would look like, would sensibly call third order cybernetics. Something that makes available or attempts to make available the life choices that people otherwise wouldn't have in fact, you know.
Looks to the societal aspect of it.
Yes, I think that's necessary. I'm not sure whether that constitutes third order cybernetics. If I happen that society's a third order system.
I think it, my view would be that it is necessary, but that nobody's ever got, well, that Bogdanov and Dewey were there long time before, far, you know, it's going to take, and I worry that unless those people propounding a third order cybernetics are willing to look at that work, the progress is going to be pretty slow.
Yes, I mean,
but Levsky does make the point that sorry, this debate is taking place in Russia because of the interest there, obviously, in Bogdanov as a Russian. Levsky does make the point, doesn't he, that it needs to be based upon Bogdanov.
Yes, probably.
Yeah.
And I think as well we can visit the fourth legal base in his levels of wording. I think there's some stuff there that will be interesting. The American law, the third one. Doesn't matter.
Anyway, it was
Sorry, may I just come in and pick up on that? Isn't that a fantastic discussion around the need for some clarity? What is third order cybernetics? I mean, we talk about Bogdanov, we talk a little bit about the notion within some US constitution. We could feed it back then to also social contracts, pre-revolution France, society creating different opportunities to people based upon a revolutionary spirit and episode. Revolution, Bolshevik revolution, there's something there to tease out. It would be fantastic to have that.
yeah, well, it is always looking to the point of whether it's useful or not to do.
What strikes me is we've got the Russian communist system on one side, Western capitalist system. We've almost got a Hegelian dialectic, and combining will get synthesis, which I'm hearing as third order cybernetics at the moment.
Potentially yes, because Bogdanov was the precursor of what you might, there's evidence that Gramsci read Bogdanov's work, and all that Western tradition of Marxism. He was in a sense a precursor of that. And then if you see the work in Chile, Stafford's work is an attempt to find a third way between hierarchical state-run communism as exists in the Soviet Union and capitalism, then there's a whole tradition of work there to be explored. People such as, what's his name, Paul Mason, draws upon Bogdanov in his work on post-capitalism. There's a guy called, I've got to be careful here, there's a, what do I say? There's a she, Mackenzie Walk, an Australian, who draws upon Bogdanov's work to look at post-capitalism in the context of ecology. There's a whole set of novels by Stanley Robinson in which a fictional version of a relative of Bogdanov is involved in the terraforming of Mars from a red to a green to a blue planet. And that looks at the kind of evolution that might have taken place to lead to the kind of sort of communist society that Bogdanov envisaged in Red Star. That they're called Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, I think, Kim Stanley Robinson. Huge, huge book. I'm sure it's about 2,000 bloody pages, this thing. Really highly rated in science fiction. It takes a bit of a reading, I can tell you, I haven't read the whole thing. Ravelli features in it. But what I'm saying is that this tradition has been explored to some extent. But it's very, very worthwhile trying to link these things up in that tradition for exactly the reason you say.
Can I just try and follow maybe on from that? My inner reactionary when I hear phrases like increased freedom of action, that's individual freedom of action, sounds like a prescription for conflict. I mean, I'm all in favour of increasing my freedom of action, but I might want you to pay the rent on my drive or something like that. You might not want to. It seems a fuzzy notion.
That's why Stafford Beer, for example, would say that freedom and control are not opposites. You know, they're part of the same thing. Regulation, you need regulation so that the individual's freedom is not interrupted by other people's freedom. There has to be that level of control.
Freedom to have a sixth child, my dad, is probably impinging on the freedom of other life forms to sort of utilise the available resources in the last decades.
Yeah, it's just in trying to develop that relationship between the difference between first, second, and third order cybernetics, it strikes me that I've lost the plot, because of course what I really want to say is that they're all the same. They're all part of pragmatism. Pragmatism can unify this this apparent division in cybernetics between first, second, and third order cybernetics. So my argument is that there isn't a first and second and third order cybernetics. They're all aspects of pragmatism. Now, the reason I say that is based upon my reading of Pickering's work, as I mentioned, the cybernetic brain, which really was important for me in understanding the British tradition of cybernetics, from Gray Walter through Ashby to Stafford to Bateson and to Pask and Lang. And I suddenly began to understand their work within the pragmatic tradition. And this was a real revelation to me. And Pickering says that his understanding of cybernetics came from his reading of William James. But he doesn't, in interpreting British cybernetics, he doesn't use the language of pragmatism. He develops his own language. He says British cybernetics was developed in the performative idiom. But this is pragmatism. He said the brain, this is Ashby actually as well, the brain is not a cognitive organ. seeking a true representation of reality. It's an embodied organ that is evolved to help human beings find their way in a world that they can never fully understand. Now that's pragmatism, you know, absolutely straight pragmatism. Dewey could have said that, James could have said that. And of course, Ashby, he doesn't try to understand in a reductionist way how all the neurons create a brain. He goes and builds a machine that adapts to the world in the same way that he thinks the brain adapts to the world, and therefore believes he can understand more about the brain as an adaptive organism because he's built a homeostat that is capable of adaptation.
Performance on ontological performance?
Yeah, ontological performance. You don't know how the thing's going to act. You know, you don't know in advance how it's going to act. You have to study it. Knowledge systems to react to other systems, and that's how knowledge emerges. You know, knowledge is not fixed, as the rationalists would say. Knowledge is always in it being created, and it's the dance of agency between different systems which creates knowledge. This is all pragmatism in Ashby. And in Walter, now this is interesting, I think. I don't know, I came across this in The Guardian, maybe it's got the date on, it has 9th of May 2022, this is in The Guardian, and it says that the entire population of Britain is to be given LSD in a government-sponsored attempt to cheer us up after the pandemic and make us forget about inflation. Well, what's it on about? It's on about a theatrical thing called the Dream Machine, whereby people can go into an arena. This is part of it. You won't believe this is part of the festival of bloody Brexit. People can go into a theatre. They sit in together with other people, because you know knowledge is created communally. They sit in a chair. They lounge back, and they're exposed to lights which are flickering at the same wavelength as the alpha rhythms of the brain, and this creates hallucinations in individuals, and they see reality differently. Now, this is available to us, you know, and this creates an LSD experience. This is what The Guardian's on about. Dream Machine Review, as close to state-funded psychedelic drugs as you can get.
Who's from the article, does it say?
yeah, this is from The Guardian.
Yeah, but the author of the article?
A guy called Jonathan Jones. Now he says, well, almost, this is giving everybody LSD, well, almost, Dream Machine is one of 10 national projects in Unboxed UK, formerly known as the Festival of Brexit. It is as close to state-funded hallucinogens as you can get. You know, so you can actually go to London, and this thing is opening in Cardiff, Belfast and Edinburgh, and have a Dream Machine hallucinogenic experience. Now, what the author says is that this is a free trip inside your own head. It's a 21st century version, fully credited, of a psychedelic technique patented in the 60s by Brian Geising, friend and collaborator of Naked Lunch author William Burroughs. Well, this is wrong. The flicker machine was invented by Gray Walter, who was a British cybernetician. And he discovered that if you exposed yourself to flickering light, which operated at the same level as the alpha rhythms of the brain, don't get me going, I don't know the then you would develop hallucinogenic experiences. Different realities would occur in your brain. And he wrote this up in a book, I think the book's called The Living Brain, Walter's book, described in Pickering. And William Burroughs read this and thought, great, I want a hallucinogenic experience. And he asked this guy, Brian Geising, that this guy credits with the invention of the flicker machine, to make him a personal flicker machine, so he could have his own hallucinogenic experiences. Geising thought, oh, William Burroughs, you know, they're not going to do this. So he did this, and Timothy Leary got onto it, and everybody got into it. It's a major thing in the 60s, the flicker machine. And actually, of course, strobe lighting had the same impact. So this article is wrong. This is a cybernetic invention, the dream machine. Geising got it from Burroughs, who got it from Gray Walter. But Walter took it beyond what the dream machine that they're now saying is such a marvelous invention. And he was able to, as the flickering affected the alpha rhythms of the brain, the way the brain operated, he also was able to connect up the brain, so it affected the flickering lights. So you got this dance of agency between two systems in Walter, far more advanced than this fucking dream machine that they've now got. And that for Pickering is the beginning of this concept of pragmatic cybernetics, the dance of agency between two systems. And that really gave me an understanding of Stafford's model that I'd not had before. So what you do with the viable system model, if you're thinking about it in the same terms, I'll use this example, lots of other examples from British cybernetics, is that you kind of launch an organization into the world, devised according to the viable system model, and you see what happens when it co-evolves with its environment. And in the process, the organization learns about its environment, and the environment learns about the potential of the organization. So this is exactly like the flicker machine. You know, the flicker machine learns about the potential of the brain and what the brain can do, and the brain adapts to the flicker machine. In my simple example, this is from past learning systems, really. You know, they have this thing, Duolingo now. Have you ever come across Duolingo? It's the best way of trying to learn another language because it adapts to your attempt to learn. It's exactly past original ideas on learning. So I got Duolingo because we had a house in Spain at one time. I thought, I'll try this bloody thing out. And so I'm learning Spanish through this Duolingo software. And what Duolingo is learning is that I'm never going to fucking learn Spanish because it keeps taking me back to stage one. You know, it's trying to understand my coping with it. As I'm trying to cope with Spanish, it's coping with me. It's the dance of two systems in a sort of agency. And you can understand, I think, the whole of cybernetics this way. It's a pragmatic discipline. And if you do so, then you have the link. And of course, Lang, you know, his experiences were, you know, psychiatrists lived with people who had mental illnesses, and the people with mental illnesses might become sane. On the other hand, the psychiatrists might go mad. You know, it's the co-evolution again. Typical 60s type experiments. But you can understand the British cybernetics and the whole of cybernetics as a pragmatic dance of agency in the performative idiom, the brain as an adaptive organism, embodied organism, the viable system model as an adaptive conception of a viable organization, co-evolving with its environment in cybernetic terms. And it provides a profound philosophy for all this work, whether first, second, or third order cybernetics. Now, Stafford, incidentally, in Decision and Control, has a couple of chapters on Peirce's work, and he talks about the development of habits of action. As far as I'm aware, Stafford never fully endorsed pragmatism, but in my view, looking at his work in terms of pragmatism is the most profound way of understanding it. He reached the same conclusion without pragmatism, basically. That's what I'm saying. Didn't need pragmatism, but for me, I needed it to understand that work. So that's cybernetics and pragmatism and Bogdanov. Is there anything else we'd want to say on that?
Just kind of reflection. So when I think about the 6 philosophical principles, 5 of them, so I can see as a kind of, not like this kind of neutrality to what's the objective. 6th one is then getting into what is actually the objective. So I can kind of see it, if I put it in terms of process, and organisation, society, I can see how all 5 principles would, or 6 principles would work in any one of those methods.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to improve the process. There's no universal truth, i.e. things haven't changed since we last changed that process.
Yeah, truth evolves. In the cybernetic sense, truth evolves through this dance of agency through systems co-evolving as well. Yeah.
When I think about the 6th principle, I'm getting then to think more into the kind of politics of how you divide up societal gains. So at the kind of societal level, is it the tyrant and the elite that get the benefits of that, or is that spread equally? I can think about at the process level, is it that team, that department that get the efficiency benefit, that get the easier job, or does the corporation say, right, we'll take 2 people off? So there's a similar thing of the way the benefits go. I'm also thinking culturally as well, things like Hofstede's cultural dimensions. And I could see that in, say, if I took Russia as an example, from history, it always seems to revert to a kind of semi-tyrannical, quite top-down. I can see the seeds of that in things like Hofstede's cultural dimensions. So I think in the 6th, I feel like we've got the politics of where the games go, but also the cultural bit of what the cultural context comfortably takes something to, will it take it to a position of reducing the autonomy and treating the individual for security and order, or will it sacrifice some of that both security and order for greater attitude of the individual?
Yeah, well put. Thank you for that. And I'll come to the last point, but thank you for also noting that I think we can tick off the points, the bases of the discussion that we were doing before the coffee. It's not a mirror of reality. You know, it's an adaptive embodied organ. It's social construction, no universal truths. Knowledge is emerging, and therefore human agencies involved. It's a different form of scientific method. You're dashing about and taking analogies, but I mean, Stafford does this well in Decision and Control, explains how that can be the basis of a Pearson notion. So let's take them as ticked off, unless you want to argue about them. Then we're left with this point. And now it's really interesting that if you look at the criticisms of Bogdanov's work and the criticisms of Stafford's work in Chile, they're exactly the same. In my mind, there are 2 types of criticism, you know, and in comparing the two, I'm always happy if I can find that the criticisms are the same, because it means that the work is likely to be the same. So I've used this in, I'm trying to use this in the article I'm doing on Bogdanov and Beer. The criticisms are of 2 forms. One that the work is schematic. In other words, it deals in general forms, tautocracy, general organizational forms, the viable system, a general organizational form that can be used at all levels of society. I have to say, in a democratic way, as it was attempted to do in Chile, but schematic. And there's a quote from Flores in Chile saying, ultimately, my problem was not the balance of varieties. It was I can't remember. It was something about the cultural differences and the arguments and the day-to-day type things that were constantly arising, you know. And so I guess somebody could say this, Lenin called Bogdanov's sort of organizational rubbish. You know, it was schematically removed. from what he was dealing with on the day-to-day, trying to make the revolution. So is it too far detached to really impact the world? And the second level of criticism is this stuff is subject to authoritarian usage. Now, interestingly, oh God, it's trying to hard. In Stalin, the people that later, when people started saying, "Oh, hang on," when Khrushchev and people like that, Kosygin started saying, "Hang on, you know, Stalin was wrong," but we don't want to denounce Lenin, for God's sake. You know, Lenin was right. They actually said where Stalin went wrong was by following Bogdanov too closely and believing that he could manipulate society from the outside, you know, through his technology. In other words, here we are, we can decide the proper balance in society, us as technocrats and as elitists, and manipulate society according to this model we have, the technological model. That's a total distortion of Bogdanov, but I mean, you know, you could see that you could use technology that way. That's why I have skepticism about technology, but go back to the philosophy of Bogdanov, incidentally. I think technology takes it in the wrong direction, just as I think, as we might come to, von Bertalanffy's general systems theory is a mockery of actually his perspectivist philosophy. With Stafford, clearly there were all sorts of articles came out during Chile, everything under control, and even from left-wing people who were saying this is technocratic. The work is technocratic, manipulative, it's imposing of a model, it's work for technocrats, you know, are the workers really involved in it? And so there was that, you know, underlying critique coming even from left-wing circles about what was going on in Chile. Again, like Bogdanov, based for the most part on misunderstanding, but nevertheless, you know, if you read Medina's work on the Chilean experiment, because of the difficulty of educating workers in the time and getting them to, because of all the other things going on, and getting them to embrace the science, which he's trying hard to do in the background. The cultural Beer is just as strong on the need for the cultural aspect of a revolution as he was, as Bogdanov was with the Politcult. Another point of similarity. A lot of it was technocratically driven. It was the managers who were deciding the indices, not the workers, because of the time scale. So the criticisms of Bogdanov and of Beer coalesce around those two same areas.
Did you ever hear the song that Stafford commissioned from Proletariat?
Yes.
It's excellent, isn't it? But it was a nice idea.
Yeah, it was.
They had a song called for a computer and a baby about to be born.
That's exactly it.
Is it?
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I'm not going to hum.
I don't know the song. I've never heard the song.
It was on not Facebook, it was on YouTube a while ago.
I've read the English. I don't speak Spanish. I've explained Duolingo. Never managed to manage me. But the translation is awful.
And I think it would never have got through the Eurovision.
You're sure? I bet I could. I bet you all know what was it? The Norwegian entry with the wolf eating its your mother. You're showing yourselves up. You watched the bloody Eurovision. You're supposed to be cybernetician. I watched it as well. But yeah, I mean, all that attempt to get the mean. He said something like the science of the economy has been done. We now have the science of governance, and we have to involve the people in this, and we need to involve artists and poets in getting the message across that science can be for the people. And Angel Power did this thing, which Stafford, I think, said in the second edition of Bain and the Firm captured exactly those 5 elements of government, which he said, which was the revolution in governance that he then wanted to take place, and he tried to simplify cybernetics into 5 principles of good government, and he says that power in that song captures the essence of those 5 elements. So it's an attempt to bring a cultural thing to bear. But the critiques of them are very similar as well. We happy with that?
Yeah, we can't have freedom and anarchism until we train people properly. Don't smile before Christmas being a proletariat for a teacher and then trying to.
Theo Wilson, who's part of that radical reductionist and so on, was describing the Enlightenment in the book I read. And he said, he described the death of the Enlightenment, which by it meant the revolution, the French Revolution. Basically, it was supposed to be built on Enlightenment ideas. It descended into everybody arguing exactly what those ideas meant. You have to be a particular discipline decipher to a particular definition and so on and so forth, until Napoleon came along and all that. But there is this thing, and I think David is hinting at it here. You've got, when you give that freedom, that you get people going into camps that they know exactly what the true meaning of something is, and so on and so forth. And that's where the problem is.
But you see, this is exactly the opposite of pragmatism and of Stafford Beer's work and of Bogdanov's work. You see, what happened? I mean, the Enlightenment was destroyed not by the French Revolution. The Enlightenment was destroyed by fucking Descartes and all that search for certainty, absolute certainty. The Renaissance form of the Enlightenment, you get in people like Montaigne, you know, is all about this, that, and the other. Oh, I really don't know, though. Here's an idea, there's an idea. I'm not quite sure about that.
Is that it tends to revert to that. People like uncertainty.
Exactly. And the reason, one of the reasons
how do we get over that problem?
One of the reasons why, you know, so you have a good Enlightenment developing post-Renaissance, people entertaining a variety of views, people actually accepting quite a lot of religious tolerance. You know, Henry IV of France and Protestantism and Catholicism working there. Suddenly you get 30 years fucking war, you know, 30 years of war, you know, and therefore you get people like Descartes building upon and working new. Everybody's searching for certainty. You know, how can we put an end to this chaos of the 30 years war? It seems no longer can we just entertain ideas in the way that Montaigne takes them. Yeah, perhaps not, perhaps not. So we get this search for certainty arising.
I was struck when John was doing the ESM book. He said, when things are going well, people are quite happy with the ESM. But when things go wrong, they revert to the real
Spectator.
so it's almost as though I see that as a sort of foxes. You know the foxes and the hedgehogs? Because you've got the foxes that are taking on all sorts of ideas and examining them and so on. When stress comes, when foreign powers try, you know, blockades on, etc., everybody goes back to the hedgehog.
Yeah. There's that tendency. But
so what we need then are rigidly defined arenas of doubt and uncertainty.
Absolutely. But interestingly, if you let me put an alternative perspective, in Montaigne sense, I don't know the answer, but an alternative perspective you get in Menan's book on pragmatism. So forget now, but it's the history of development of pragmatism, and he says that Piers, James were influenced by the American Civil War, the brutality of the American Civil War. And what they saw in the American Civil War was people pursuing certainty. They thought they had it right. And therefore, their whole philosophy was to try to say to people, hang on, there are no universal truths. Let's look for the truth which actually benefited humankind. So he sees pragmatism as emerging from...
But Popper would argue that people like Stalin, Hitler, and so on, who descended from Plato, they had absolute truths, whether it was genetic or social or whatever. But Marxism, communism, in its form
In its,
in Russia, was search for certainty, and that led, along with Hitler's search for certainty in terms of the master race and so on, so led to the horrors of the Second World War. And the American Civil War was a pre-running of the First and Second World Wars, really, the first industrial war. So, the question I'm asking is, I think we're all in favour here of pragmatism and so on and so forth. How do we ensure that? Because as Popper, I think Popper, wasn't it? The tolerance paradox in the sense that when you tolerate ideas and so on, you also tolerate oppressive ideas. So how do you make sure people follow the tolerant ideas without forcing them, as against the intolerant ideas that people might want to revert back to because they want certainty?
Yeah, people do revert back to.
One answer to that is, it's a question of how my morality improves further up Maslow's hierarchy of needs I am, and I don't propose to be a cannibal, but in a tempting situation, I might be driven to that, and so might you. My favourite one from a film is Stanislav Lem, in Solaris, which was Siberia, which was teach the problem of phenomenology. If you can make the person you're trying to interact with just a little bit more insecure as to what their main philosophy or mission in life is, then you're in with the chapter. And one of the best ways to do that is to show that you're in the same space.
Well, my problem is, how do you make people? But that's you said the best way to make people morally that how my problem is that phrase, how do you make? Okay. Because I was John was saying about wasn't that empowering people, allowing them the space in which they can take empowerment of themselves.
I mean, nature shows a mixture of cooperation and control. Maybe there's some other one with most.
Probably discussion. I was going to just say, my reading of design of freedom was clearly arguing that you need control. I think you actually
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Before you can have a freedom. So
yeah,
which
part
can
and
actually be changed.
two sides of the same.
Change through a feedback loop, but you need to operate in a condition of regulations and laws and so on to have your own freedom. I can't drive on the right hand side of the road, for example, and so I won't get very far. But I can, if I drive on the left hand side, I've got a certain amount of freedom.
I think this would be the observed series of pictures. So
having a discussion.
Yeah, I was trying to look for a quotation from Lem that I think I've got in this book in Siberia. If anybody's not read it, should read it.
There are short stories in Siberia which I find very funny.
I like Cybernetic Congress. It's my favourite Lem.
But I can't find it. Sorry.
Yeah, Michael, we started talking about complexity earlier on, and you were making the point about these various analogies with biological sciences or extend that to mathematical sciences. It just struck me as you were saying that, the kind of the joy that I certainly saw through my own travels is the precision argument that the future is under perpetual construction.
Yeah, absolutely.
The hour of time and all the sort of implications of
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
system physics and chemistry.
Thank you. That's exactly right. The complexity theorists who take Pigogene as their source are closer to the pragmatist way of thinking than, for example, the Santa Fe type complexity theorists. That's exactly right. And if you read, you read Stacey and their form of complexity theory. Complexity theory has its three orders as well, if you like. It has first order complexity theory is Stacey in his original form, where he saw the way to manipulate organizations was to bring them to the edge of chaos, so that you've got this balance between order and disorder. And let's say the Santa Fe tradition is in the same mode, that somehow you model a reality and then you can maybe do something with the model that you get, the agent-based modeling stuff. That's their first order. In actual fact, I think, the Santa Fe stuff is not systemic at all. It's highly reductionist, and in drawing a pragmatist Bogdanovist border around the systems approach, I'd quite happily expel that bloody stuff, because I just, the notion that's, again, it misses out society. You base it all on the agent. You believe that somehow you can capture the complexity of individual, in certain rules. It's just not in any way systemic. So, but there is a first order kind of complexity theory based on Stacey's early work. Second order complexity theory is Stacey when he embraces the work of George Herbert Mead, who was, of course, along with Peirce, Dewey and James, one of the founders of American pragmatism, Mead taking it in a sociological direction, interactionism was Mead. And Mead, clearly, all aspects of pragmatism there in Mead's conception. And Stacey's version of complexity theory is all George Herbert Mead, complex processes of adapting, what he calls it. There's no complexity theory left in Stacey. All it is, the bits and pieces of complexity theory dragged in to his favourite sociologist, George Herbert Mead. Moles, this guy who's written this bloody book on complexity theory and has the nerve to write a book on complexity theory without mentioning cybernetics or systems. He actually, there's a lot in that book, not just from Mead, but from Peirce, from Dewey, and from James. So that is embracing pragmatism. There are forms of complexity theory, the Callahan and Byrne type stuff, which is a bit, tries to take society more seriously. What the complexity theories tend to, I'm always saying that they're promiscuous. In other words, they ally themselves with any form of social theory that they happen to prefer, and translate complexity theory into that. But anyway, there is this big tradition of complexity. Well, there's not a big tradition. There's a tradition of complexity theory which is clearly pragmatically orientated, derives from Pigogene. You can find it in Moles. You can find it particularly in the book Embracing Complexity by Gene Bolton and Peter Allen. They're a bit more Pigogene based. So there's your potential link between complexity theory and cybernetics and pragmatism and Bogdanovism. There's that potential link which takes us closer to this unity of the systems approach as a whole. So you're asking, what about von Bertalanffy and that other tradition that we've not talked about yet?
This is C, the third order of complexity.
Sorry?
This is C, the third order of complexity.
No, this is my typical analytical thing. If I'm looking for three types of general systems thinking, I go general systems theory, cybernetics, complexity theory. And what I'm now doing is the general system theory bit. We've agreed cybernetics, well, we haven't agreed, but we've been talking about cybernetics as a potentially pragmatist, Bogdanovist development. We've said that you can find it in complexity theory. Now I want to say that you can also find it all in general systems theory and the systems methodologies that have emerged. So if you look at von Bertalanffy is an interesting case. Let's say that systems thinking generally starts, general systems theory starts there with him. I mean, he was influenced, of course, by the Gestalt psychologists. You read his book on general systems theory, there's a lot of stuff from Gestalt psychology in there. And they were influenced by Ernst Mach, the same guy who influenced Bogdanov and who influenced the pragmatists. So we've got a good starting point here. And if you take Bogdanov, the philosopher, instead of Bogdanov, the inventor, or the somebody who wanted to initiate mathematical general system theory, then you find a pragmatist bent. His philosophy was something called Perspectivism, which it all depends upon the perspective that you take, and different perspectives are useful for different things. And this actually comes from a guy called Cassirer, who was another pragmatist orientated philosopher. So that natural science develops along a pragmatist lines, you know, different theories of science which are useful for particular periods of time till they're replaced by something else. And similarly, we can see developments he was interested in the symbolic universe. And actually, he starts from, you know, primitive ideas and myths, then to religion, then to more advanced forms of thinking, Cassirer. But he says that all the time we've always got the potential to be dragged back into mythology. This is exactly your point, of somehow this horrible side of human nature of things taking over again. You know, the search for a certainty in Hitlerism or Stalinism or whatever. Somehow we've got to protect this more advanced, pragmatic way of thinking, the arenas of where debate can take place and where people are willing to listen. All this has to be protected. But anyway, if you read, there's a biography of von Bertalanffy by a guy whose name I forget, which looks at all the good sides of von Bertalanffy. And he sees him very much, his whole career has been this fight against mechanism. And he calls him a humanistic general systems theorist, because he was, of course, opposed to Skinnerism. You know, he believed that the mind was an open system and was capable of creating. He talks about it in terms of creating its own universe, the mind. There's von Bertalanffy. There isn't a lot in Maturana and Varela, you know. It's not in von Bertalanffy if you read von Bertalanffy closely. And he's very much more of a constructivist and a perspectivist in his philosophy than he is a hardline mathematical general systems theorist. And so there's always this tension in von Bertalanffy between the philosophy and the general system theory. Just as there's a tension in Bogdanov, I find between the philosophy and the techtology. And I cannot reconcile those. I cannot reconcile how Bogdanov gets the techtology from his philosophy, nor can I reconcile how von Bertalanffy gets to general system theory from his perspectivism, although he does say that perspectivism is only, they try to do it. I mean, but von Bertalanffy says perspectivism is only one form of, general system theory is only one form of perspective, which we might find useful. Pragmatist conception again, and Bogdanov's always talking about technology as a continual, you know, it's not fixed forever. It'll continue to evolve as we learn more in the specialist sciences. But von Bertalanffy was a pragmatist. If you ignore the excesses of the general system, of course, there's another biography of von Bertalanffy by Prof, which shows him not to have been quite such a humanistic general systems theorist, but a bit of a you know, whichever way the wind blows, and some nasty stuff when he was at the University of Vienna, you know, in favor of Nazism. So you've got to be careful. And you know, it goes back to that other argument again. I forget what Provo's book's called, but the danger of holism or something, you know. And what he's saying is that if you believe you've got a holistic vision, which you as a technocrat can understand from the outside, and you can use to manipulate other people, then it can immediately become dangerous again. You know, however much you don't want, that's not what you mean, or that's not what you understand by holism. It has the potential to be used dangerously. The concept of an organismic whole, you know, Bertalanffy was relating that to Nazism in certain articles that he wrote at that time. Anyway, two biographies of Bertalanffy, both worth reading. One is a hagiography very much influenced, I think, by von Bertalanffy's wife, was the guy who wrote that one. And he didn't have access to Bertalanffy's letters and papers that Provo had access to, and which gives this other view of him as a bit of, you know, he'll twist what he says according to the politics of the time.
I was going to say, I think you can get your top order of analysis right, and then go down a level and get things wrong. For me, the example is Hayek, who knew about neural nets and saw the market as a perfect information transmission device, except it is not perfect. It may be the best we've got, and markets, to stop them going to oligarchy, need to be, oligarchy, need to be controlled. And so whether you can damn somebody because they become, say, a Nazi, I'm not sure. I know going the other way, you can't damn vegetarianism because Hitler approved of it.
No, it's another sort of argument. Of course, you could have the argument about von Bertalanffy, but Heidegger's the big case, you know, who was far more flagrantly a Nazi for some certain period of time than von Bertalanffy was. But do we dismiss his philosophy because of that?
Okay. Einstein, I held up the progress of cosmology for 5 years because I refused to believe in the universe expanding. So if he can be wrong.
Yeah.
He was right. He thought he was wrong and changed it. But the cosmological constant in to account to stabilise it, where he should have just stayed with his original equation.
Yeah, I mean, what I would like to do at this place is just 5 minutes to finish the argument, and then I like to talk about what I know about, and then we'll join a general discussion on things I don't know about, which we do now.
The original ends of finishing of a file. I mean, it's convenient, you know, where stories and novels be, and you put it in the lecture. Well, you're expected to, but you could say, hey, so.
Well, I'll end on some, but so you get forms of operational research that have been, Ormerod's done a lot of work on that relation to pragmatism. systems engineering, and the concept of engineering itself is almost pragmatic. It's not based upon hard science all the time. There's not, people are always, as Megan knows, people are searching for a science of systems engineering, a science of systems that can underpin systems engineering. Well, you know, I like saying that's like waiting for Godot. It's not going to happen. Let's accept that different systems have different pragmatic approaches. Will always be there. Soft systems thinking. Well, you know, Akoff and Churchman were students of E.A. Singer, a pragmatist philosopher. E.A. Singer was a student of William James. So if you read Churchman and Akoff, pragmatism is writ large right through all their work. Checkland was a student of Churchman. Pragmatism is writ large through all his work. The other big influence on Checkland was Lewin. Lewin was a student of Peirce's. So, you know, all that soft systems tradition is Golding's The Image as well. All that is pragmatist, a form of pragmatism. Socio-technical system thinking through Lewin is a form of pragmatism. Ulrich's critical systems heuristics, influenced by Churchman, who you know, self-declared pragmatist based upon Singer's work, and upon Habermas. And Habermas, you know, reads Peirce and James and Dewey's right through his books in arriving at the concept of communicative competence and distorted communication. So that tradition from von Bertalanffy into the various systems methodologies which dominate, if you like, a lot of the UK systems community. I'm talking about the narrow systems community there that associate with the UKSS and stuff. The methodological stuff is all pragmatist in orientation. So we have a potential, using Bogdanov and pragmatism, to find commonalities and to see ourselves as part of this tradition, pragmatic tradition, and talk to each other as cyberneticians, as complexity theorists, as systems thinkers, and develop our work within this tradition, talking to those in social theory and philosophy who also embrace that tradition. And just to bring this to an end, ex-colleague of Peter's and myself and at Hull was a guy called Zichang Zhu, who has looked at the work of Confucius and Taoism and that pragmatic turn in Eastern philosophy. And he's written a book with Nanaka, the guy who invented the concept of knowledge management. And they say, undertaking a pragmatic turn, it is useful to appreciate what the similarities and differences are, how different pragmatist traditions can learn from each other, and most importantly, how they can inform strategic actions of today. And that book is about linking trends of systems thinking based upon Western pragmatism with the work of Confucius and Taoism based upon an Eastern philosophies which have very close similarities to pragmatism. Dewey is regarded very highly in, it's a commonplace to see similarities between Dewey's work and Confucianism, for example. And one final quote, I've just read a book by a guy called Junker Porter, who seeks to convey to us, brought up in the Western tradition, the essence of Australian indigenous thought. The book's called Sand Talk. A nice read. He doesn't claim to. I mean, I think he's half Aboriginal and half white Australian. He doesn't claim to have been brought up wholly in the Aboriginal tradition, indigenous tradition of indigenous thought. But he does say, you know, if you were a Roman trying to understand the Gauls, would you want somebody translating for you who was a bit in both camps, you know? And that's his message. I don't think this indigenous thought is it's powerful. It has to be accepted in its own right, but you know, I'm translating it for you. This is Young Porter. He says there are no isolated variables. Every element must be considered in relation to the other elements and the context. Areas of knowledge are integrated, not separated. He's trying to convey indigenous knowledge. The relationship between the knower and other knowers, places and senior knowledge keepers is paramount. I don't like that, senior knowledge keepers. It facilitates shared memory and sustainable knowledge systems. An observer does not try to be objective, but is integrated within a sentient system that is observing itself. Second order cybernetics, as well as pragmatism and Bogdanovism there. So, you know, a lot of traditions, Eastern and indigenous, that can perhaps potentially talk to each other through the common language of pragmatism. And for us as cyberneticians, systems thinkers, and complexity theorists, then Bogdanov does a very good job of translating pragmatism into systemic terms, I think. And the concept of a third order cybernetics, I think, is necessary, linking in with the system tradition and some aspects of the complexity tradition, all capable of being further developed through this unified approach. As I said at the beginning, if we can somehow see ourselves as part of this same tradition of work, which I regard as the most powerful tradition of philosophy, let's forget about, you know, trying to understand the universe. Let's try and accept that we're embodied creatures and we're trying to create a world in which everybody can live better. Then if we can all understand systems thinking and cybernetics complexity theory as part of this, in fact, developing this in terms of the practical approaches that we've got, the viable system model, some of the soft systems, methodologies, etc., we can add to this tradition, then we're going to be in a much better position to present our case to government and to present our case to policymakers in the World Health Organization than we are as distinct, disparate groupings. And we're also going to be in a much better position to talk and advance what we do by discussion with the pragmatist-orientated philosophers and social theorists, who, as Bacon said, have dominated the field. They're the most interesting people in social theory and philosophy these days. And if we're akin to those traditions and can talk to those traditions and learn from them, and they accept that's something that we've got to offer them, then again, we've got this opportunity to advancing our transdiscipline of systems approach, cybernetic approach, if you like, in much more rapidly and much more influentially than we have done, I think, so far. Right, so that's what I think I know, but let's get on to things that I don't know to talk about. Yeah.
So you spent a great conversation. Thank you for a great conversation about theory of pragmatism. What about pragmatism in the sense of bringing some research reality into expanding that body?
Well, pragmatism, of course, doesn't give up on, I say, pragmatists accept an objective reality. All they say is that we're never going to get an objective view of what that, for all time, eternal truths about what that reality is like. Of course, we can continually learn from our engagements with that reality as scientists who do experiments, as people by learning from the past, the way that this is what Kim Stanley Robinson's novels are about, looking at different societal forms and how they have benefited people and individuals and allowed them to develop their potential while working together for society as a whole. How has that played out in the past? And can we, in a Bogdanov sense, learn from all that pragmatic experience of the past to build better societies in the future? You know, it seems to me there are so many lessons that we can learn from the past. A lot of them have been expressed in this conversation that we've been having, but we find it bloody difficult to learn from them, don't we? How the hell have we ended up with another war in Europe? I mean, I wrote this paper on pragmatism, this bloody draft paper that we're exploring today, and thank you for that. And I finished it, and I was saying to anybody that would listen to me and to my wife, Putin will not invade Ukraine. He won't invade Ukraine. You know, we've moved beyond that sort of thing. It would be such madness and such craziness. And then the fucker invades Ukraine. I thought, I'm going to have to rethink this whole paper. This is a completely different concept. It's beyond my understanding. I'll start rethinking things again. But anyway.
Isn't it at the time? Yeah. I'm just saying, one of my favourite analogies is in Prof, but I subsequently found it all over the place, so I'm assuming you could. But this idea of trying to rebuild the ship while it's at sea. Yes. Which will end up in a complete disaster. Even if you get the bits changed, people, as the generations go, people will have different ideas of what a good society is anyway. So maybe the need is for peaceful development to introduce these ideas into things like all various organisations. I don't work with, but other people might work with, and so on, so that it spreads peace, as I say, piecemeal way, rather than to change the whole of society at one foul swoop.
The problem is we've got no option but to rebuild the ship at sea at the moment. But you're right. If we don't do, if we try and do that wholesale,
you can change it while it's at sea.
Yeah.
You still keep seaworthy, but
yeah, exactly.
This is incrementalism.
just one thing was in regards to the application of complex systems in itself. So the organisation I'm in, we're approached constantly with organisations, companies telling us that they can sort everything out for us. And you know, working with John and looking at what we were doing yesterday with DSM, one of the things I find, and you mentioned this paper as well, you know, from Hertfordshire. How does that stop? How do we reset?
It's a real issue because system thinking is becoming. This is the other side of the coin. The notion of system thinking has become incredibly popular. So you get all kinds of consultants and charlatans selling anything as systems thinking, and they know nothing about the history or the tradition of it. So you know they're going to discredit it before long unless we seize control of the agenda again and say, hang on, there's a whole history of this. We've learned this, we've learned that. We know a little bit about what works, a little bit what doesn't work, and say, hang on, this is not a panacea. It's you know, piecemeal rebuilding and learning as we go along. We don't have an instant solution, but a lot of the consultants who are seeking to sell systems thinking are selling it as a solution. And if we don't watch it, we're going to all of us be discredited. So, I know, cybernetics. Yeah, thank you. Somebody told me what that was like. It didn't work.
Do you think that looking at maybe is it fair to say, I mean, one perspective is to say, well, that's what consultants are selling. I might step back and say that that's what the consumers want to buy. There's a reason why someone is projecting, here's a panacea, and here's something that will give you instant relief. And someone, to make an analogy from an organization perspective, make it policymakers, it doesn't matter, but if you're in what seems like intolerable back pain, someone comes and says, I can do something about this in the near term, doesn't that sound great?
Yeah, you're absolutely.
Reason why that, if it wasn't selling, people wouldn't be offering that would be, that would change. So I just reflect back, some of it is
Somebody-
managing the expectations. So why is it that?
Yeah,
people
lots-
say just
So
need
it's
that?
there's a quote from somewhere, there's lots of simple solutions, neat, convincing and wrong. You know, that when there are no simple solutions to complexity, unfortunately.
But some of that, I think, is managing the expectation of someone who's facing what they say they come correctly to the conclusion that they have a complex situation in front of them, is expecting a simple solution, a simple approach, like you mentioned at the very beginning of this. Why is it we're tempted to say, well, go science should create this glossary of a tool, a toolkit, well, here's the methods. How is that actually going to help? If we don't take a step back and say, what's the utility of this, and that's why we're doing it. Which I mean, to then expand on that, I know it's a broad question, not really expecting a simplistic answer, but I would also, because I think it's been a really interesting conversation, but I'm also tempted to take a step back and say, but if the original intent and the observation was we have these different schools of thought and people who don't seem to be collaborating, and that in itself is not desirable, how is this, just taking a step back and saying, how is this going to, well, first, how are they going to react to this?
Yeah, absolutely.
And how will it help? So if we kind of look forward, is it going to get us to the desired state, or not necessarily in its own right, but is it a piece to that, and what's the progression?
I mean, I think,
That's at least how I'm thinking about it.
I think,
I'm not expecting a simple response.
no, but I think, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm starting at the beginning of what might constitute a response, you know, trying to find a philosophy at least that we can agree upon. And then we can start looking at the other things. But I agree also, there is another issue, I think, which we maybe got looking at the same time, which is that people will need different understandings of systems according to the, I mean, a policymaker will need, we need to convince a government minister system thinking could be useful to me. We need to convince somebody who's going to provide funding that it's going to provide, system thinking is going to provide benefits. So we have to provide a slightly different message to them on what the benefits are they'll get from system thinking. For the person who's going to use it, the practitioner, then they need the concepts and the methodologies and all that stuff. So we've got to find convincing messages for these different audiences, which are nevertheless on the same page. You know, they don't contradict one another. And also, these messages have to be true. There are all kinds of ways of simplifying systems thinking. We were having this discussion. There are all kinds of ways of simplifying systems thinking, but some detract entirely from the power of the ideas. I would argue that the Cabrera DSRP detracts entirely from the power of the system's ideas. It's a simplification of it, but it loses everything that's important about it. So there's a lot of work to be done in finding this elevated pitch, which does not detract from the power of the ideas. And this is the stage that the work's at, I guess.
I think it's a bit of balance, right? Maybe there's what resonates to me is I think that there needs to be a tailored approach and not a one-size-fits-all attempt. And there's also, I think, the reality that you can't package up in that message something that sounds so complex and challenging that in itself would be off-putting. I think it's going to be so hard to get a benefit, probably won't actually start the progression. So
yeah.
It's not inherently a false message, but you have to give someone kind of an incremental hope to get along the maturity model, if you want to call it that.
And we haven't got that message yet. We haven't got it. You're exactly right.
I think we have to call it like, we can get shots instead of just you.
No, I don't care. I'm just going to eat all bloody sandwiches. Was it good, Mike? Were they good?
Yeah, they were excellent.
Were they
Absolutely
excellent? We've got a good audience then. Should we say thank you?
Yeah.
All I can say with absolute certainty is your last hour has been better than my last hour. I wasn't even in here.
You're on Zoom.
I know, it's fine. Abdul knows me well enough. Cheers, Abdul. See you soon.
Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone. Cheers. Bye.
University Services.